A Daughter of the Samurai. Chapter 30. The White Cow. When Hanano was 15, the family council brought up the subject I had been most dreading. According to Japanese custom, when there are only daughters in a family, a son is adopted who takes the family name and marries the eldest daughter. Thus, the name is perpetuated. The question of the selection of a son for me I had dealt with in as tactful a manner as possible, but after having refused 2 or 3 offers, I saw that I was expected to give a positive decision soon. It is never wise for a Japanese woman, if she wishes to retain a position of influence and dignity, to say much on any subject. Actions, not words, are her most successful means of expression, but the time came when I saw that I must speak. With a letter of wise suggestions from my ever-faithful American mother in my hand, I went before the council and asked to be allowed to take the children back to my former home for a few years more of study. This request caused excited discussions, but I now had friends in the council, both of Matsuo's family and of my own, and my past faithful adherence to their wishes brought a glorious reward. Again, my petition was granted, and, with my heart weighted with gratitude and my soul singing with joy, I began my preparations to return to America. With Chio, our going was a question of whether to be glad or sad. Leaving her little friends and her loved school to go back to a vagueness in which only Grandma stood out vividly was a serious thing, but Hanano's joy was profound. She was quiet but busy every moment, going about with light, quick steps and singing softly all the while, and I never glanced at her that I did not meet a bright smile. Many times during the weeks of preparation, as I watched her happy face, the thought came to me that if such a cruel thing could happen as that she would never reach the land of her heart's love, I should always be grateful anyway for the quiet, overflowing joy of this season of hope. Nothing could ever take away that happy memory. The busy weeks flew by, and at last there came a morning when the children, who had been turning down their fingers to count the days, gleefully announced that only 2 widespread hands were left. 10 days! We were almost ready, but however well one may plan, there always seem to be some unfinished things that are pushed away until the last crowded days. The children had never been to Nagaoka. Many times I had planned to go, but life was full for us and something had always interfered. But I could not allow them to leave Japan without a visit to the place where their grandmother lay beside her husband among the graves of our ancestors. So early one spring morning we started. How different was this trip from the one of years before, which I took with my brother when on my way to a school in Tokyo. Instead of a journey of several days spent sometimes perched upon a high wooden saddle, sometimes tucked snugly into a swinging kago, and sometimes rolled and jolted along the rough path in a jinrikisha, this was only 14 hours of comfortable riding on a brisk little narrow-gauge train that wound its puffing way up the mountains through 26 tunnels that represented some of the world's finest engineering. Between these dashes of darkness were welcome glimpses of sunny hillsides terraced with rice fields and a narrow winding road that I remembered well. Just at twilight we found ourselves on the station platform of a busy town, having a background of hills bristling with the skeleton towers of multitudinous oil wells. I had been told of these changes, but my slow mind had failed to realize how entirely my Nagaoka was a dream of the past. I was glad that the children's first sight of the town was in cherry blossom time, for even to me the buildings looked smaller and the streets narrower than I had pictured them in my stories. Everything might have proved a disappointment to them had it not been for the glow and freshness that peeped over the plaster walls, glorified the temple yard, and showed from the tinted branches of the trees lining every street. There was a faint breeze on our first morning, and as our slow jinrikshas jogged along the strangely unfamiliar road to Chokoji, the air was filled with fragrance from the pink, shell-like petals that were continually dropping or lying in drifts on the sloping roofs of the snow sheds which hung over the sidewalks. How we loved these fruitless, beautiful trees, emblem of our dying knighthood, I thought with a sigh, and then I looked toward the hill where the castle used to stand, and an amused gleam of satisfaction came to me. The old spirit of protection still dwelt amidst the ruins, for on the foundation rocks rose a huge fire tower with its high platform and warning gong. The old house was no more. I had hoped that brother would decide to return in time and spend his old age in the home of his youth, for the gentle little wife that he had taken in late middle life had lived only long enough to bring an heir to the Inagaki family, and then had drifted out of life as gently as she lived in it, during her scant score of quiet years. But all brother's interests were in a distant city amid the progressive whir of factories and modern life, and he would listen to no plans beyond the education of his son. So the gods of utility and commerce had taken charge, and all that were left of our worthless treasures were removed to sister's go-down. Then Gia and Ishi had gone to distant homes, and now in place of the great rambling house with its sagging thatch and tender memories stood the ugly foreign buildings of the normal school for girls, the old chestnut tree beneath which was Shiro's grave, and the archery field where so often I had seen father and Mr. Toda, each with his right sleeve slipped from a bare shoulder in a strenuous but laughing game of competition, was lost in a wide gravelled campus where modern schoolgirls marched and drilled in pleated skirts and foreign shoes. Strange indeed it seemed, and full of heartache for me. I realized that these changes pointed towards a future of usefulness and hope, and I would not have retarded them for the world, but all the quiet pleasures and picturesque life of the past had been merged into a present that looked cheap and sordid. It was hard for me, during my few days in the old town, to keep my memories of beautiful old customs and ideals from completely overshadowing the new progressive path that I was striving to follow. When our duty of love and honour to the dear ones was over, we went with sister, who had come to Nagaoka, to meet us, to her home on a mountain a few hours jinriksha ride distant. It was an odd little village where she lived. So narrow was the ledge upon which it stretched its one street length that from the valley below it looked as if a toy town of plaster walls and thatched roofs had been pinned up against the green side of the mountain. We left the valley, each with tandem pullers and a pusher behind. It was a steep climb up a winding path from which reached out on either side long, even lines of scrubby trees. Occasionally the men would stop and, bracing themselves, would rest the shafts against their hips and wipe their hot faces. "It's a breathless climb," said one as he smiled and pointed down into the valley, "but it's worth the labour just to see yon terraces of green against the great brown rocks and the sunny blue of the sky reflected brokenly in the rippling stream below." "Hi," said another, "so it is. The city fellows see naught but level streets and dusty roofs, peeping above the walls or fences of wood. I pity them." Then on they went, panting but content. "What are these low twisted bushes with the grey trunks and so many fresh little buds?" asked her Nano in one of these pauses. "Mulberry trees," replied sister. "This is a silk-cultured district, and the mountain is covered with cocoon villages. Almost every house here has wooden frames filled with trays of silkworms, and on a quiet day you can hear the rustle of their feeding as you walk along the street. That sounded interesting indeed to the children, and as we went on, they shouted questions and exclamations to each other about silkworms and their mulberry leaf diet, until the long climb ended in a short, steep pull and an abrupt turn into a broad street of low, wide-eaved houses. At the farther end stood the large house of the village, Sister's home. Its brownish-yellow thatch rose above a wall of rounded stones topped with a wooden fence, so like the ones surrounding my old home in Nagaoka that the sight brought a shadow ache of homesickness to my heart. With cordial country manners, the servants had come out to the big wooden gateway, and as our jinrickshaws rolled between the two lines of bowing figures, I caught familiar murmurs of the old-fashioned greeting, "O kari asobasi," your return is welcome. The quiet house seemed very restful after our long jolting ride, and the hot bath, which is always ready in the old-fashioned Japan for the expected visitor, refreshed us wonderfully. The children and I had just returned to the living room where, settling ourselves comfortably on soft cushions, we were gazing across the porch, straight out into the blue sky, for the valley and the world were far below us, when two maids appeared bringing in dainty little tables for luncheon. "You'll have to do without meat up here," said Sister apologetically as she came hurrying in. "We have only chickens and vegetables from my farm and fish from the mountain streams. We cannot get meat or bread." "That matters nothing," I replied. "The children are fond of fish and rice, and you know that I always liked everything green that grows. Don't you remember the white cow?" Sister laughed, and Hanano, always on the alert for a story, asked, "What is it about a white cow?" So, as we ate, Sister told a story of my childhood, which dated back so far that my knowledge of it was only what others told me. "Your mother was not a very strong child," she began, "yet she was never really sick either. At that time, many of the Nagaoka people, when they were puzzled and helpless about a really serious matter, used to consult the priestess of a small Shinto shrine just outside the town. An honourable grandmother asked father to send for the holy woman. For 2 days before she came, Etsuko was not allowed to eat whale meat soup or onion or any food with an odour, and she was carefully instructed to be extremely good both in behaviour and in thought. Early on the important morning, Ishi sprinkled her with cold water, then she dressed her in her crest dress and took her to Honourable Grandmother's room. All the family were there and several women relatives. I remember how Etsuko looked as she toddled in, holding on to Mother's hand. She bowed to everyone, and Mother seated her on the mat beside Honourable Grandmother, just a little in front of the rest of us. The tokonoma was covered with straw matting and decorated with all the sacred Shinto emblems. Of course, the priestess was in the most honoured seat of all. She was dressed in pure white, and her black hair was hanging down her back, tied behind the shoulders with a band of rice straw, from which dangled strips of white zigzag-cut Shinto paper. When Mother and Etsuko were seated, the holy priestess prostrated herself 2 or 3 times. Then she lifted from the tokonoma a whitewood rod that had on the end a bunch of long streamers of holy paper. She waved it above Etsuko's head, murmuring some religious ritual. We all sat very quiet with bowed heads. After a moment of silence, the priestess announced that she had just learned from the gods that Etsuko, in a previous existence, had been a small white cow used in drawing lumber for the building of a Shinto shrine on the top of a mountain. The message said that the little creature had toiled up the rocky path so patiently and faithfully day after day, and had lent its strength so willingly for the holy duty, that the gods had hastened the slow steps of transmigration and allowed the soul of the white cow to enter at once into the present life as a human being. "Do you mean that my mama was a white cow?" asked Hanno with wide-open, astonished eyes, while Chio stopped eating and looked at me with alarm. "Father didn't believe the priestess," added Sister, smiling. "Nevertheless, to please Honourable Grandmother, he made a generous gift to the shrine. But he always said it was not so much a gift of gratitude to the gods as it was a token of satisfaction that he could now account for Etsubo's exceeding fondness for all green vegetables and her little liking for fish." Now, whether it really was true or not doesn't matter any more than any other fairy story, but it's lucky for you children that your honourable mother is a faithful and a patient puller, for she has climbed over a rocky path of obstacles and at last is ready to pull you all the way over to America. And she nodded merrily at the children as she served me another generous helping of bamboo shoots and greens. A few days later, one of Sister's neighbours, whose son was a successful oil merchant in Tokyo, came to see us. Meeting her recalled to both Hanano and me a very amusing incident connected with a call from the son's wife soon after we'd gone to Tokyo to live. She was a lady of the new rich aristocracy, progressive, wealthy, and altogether haikara, a recently coined word which implied the very essence of what was stylish and up to date. She was beautifully attired in Japanese dress, of course, but even the most progressive women had not reached the stage where European dress was worn on elegant occasions. After a long ceremonious bow and the usual complimentary inquiries regarding the health of family and relatives, and also a few tactful remarks in praise of the flowers arranged on the tokonoma, she leaned forward and unwrapped a square of beautiful crepe, exquisitely dyed and embroidered. It is an age-old Japanese custom when calling upon a friend to take a gift, and my guest lifted out and presented modestly, but with evident pride, a large imported paper box on which was printed in fancy English letters, "Imported dainties, a foreign delicacy possessing the fragrance of flowers, used by ladies and gentlemen in the cultured society of Europe and America." It was a large wholesale package of ordinary chewing gum, the elaborate ceremonious manner of my guest's every movement being in accordance with the strictest etiquette, made the unexpected appearance of that plebeian package a most incongruous and amusing thing. Yet this was a perfectly natural gift for her to make. It was not easy to choose a suitable present for a person who had lived for several years in America and who was believed to be foreign in her tastes, so my guest had gone to a store where foreign things were sold and with considerable care had selected this as being an especially appropriate gift for me. And Nano and Chio had been in the room when the box was presented. Chio looked with grave interest upon the foreign lettering. Of course she could not read it, but Hanano's first careless glance, as we all bowed slightly in acknowledgement of the kindness, was followed instantly by another quick look. Then, with a strange contortion of countenance, she bowed a deep "Excuse me," and slipped quickly from the room. As soon as the caller had gone, she hurried to me. "Oh, Mama," she cried gleefully, "just to think that Nakayama-sama should select that gift for you. What would she think if she could only know how you scolded me that time in America when I came home from school chewing a piece of gum? And how you made me wash my mouth with salt and told me that if we were in Japan, Ishi would say that I looked like the Buddhist picture of a starving soul in the hell of hunger." Sister was very much interested in this story. "It seems a peculiar custom," she said, "but it is not so harmful as the one from which originated our blackening the teeth." "When did that start, sister?" I asked. "Several people in America asked me, and I could only tell them that ridiculous story of the old homey wife who stained her teeth by mistake, and I made her so beautiful that she won devotion from her husband and envy from all the other wives." "There are many stories as absurd as that about our old customs," said sister. "When I made my first visit home with black teeth, I heard father and Mr. Totter talking about our ancestors once having had a fashion of chewing something. But the story that the Honourable Grandmother told me was this. Long ago, when everybody had white teeth, there lived a young wife whose jealous husband accused her of smiling to show her beautiful teeth. That day, when cutting eggplant for dinner, she took some thin peelings and put them over her teeth. The husband returned, and seeing how beautifully the purple colour contrasted with his wife's olive skin and scarlet lips, angrily asked why she had decorated herself. She told him she had just tried to cover her teeth so that they would not show. Recognizing her modest worth, her husband was jealous no longer. Thus, more attractive than ever, she became a model to imitate, and in time the added beauty of blackened teeth came to be the emblem of a trusted and dutiful wife. That is the story that Honourable Grandmother was told when she was married. What sister had heard father and Mr. Totter talking about was probably the theory which is considered the most reasonable explanation for our custom of blackening the teeth. It is an historical fact that the first conquerors of Japan, who no doubt came originally from the hot shores of Central Asia, planted betel orchards in the warm islands of South Japan, where they first landed. But on account of difference in soil and climate, it was almost impossible to make the trees grow. So, in a few years, the habit of betel chewing became necessarily confined to those who represented wealth and rank. An ancient imperial coach used by an emperor who reigned more than 1,000 years ago, and which is now in the Art Museum of Tokyo, was roofed with a thatch made of the husk of betel nuts. This speaks of the rarity of the betel trees at that time, for of course the imperial cart was the most costly vehicle in the land. When the time came that only people of the highest class had betel-stained teeth, imitations became the fashion and substitutes were found. During the Middle Ages, long after the nuts were extinct in Japan, both men and women of high rank blackened their teeth with a powder made from wild nut from the mountains. The imperial courtiers kept up this custom to 1868. At that time, even Meiji Tenno, the emperor of the Restoration, had blackened teeth. The samurai never stained their teeth. They took pride in scorning any fashion that spoke more of luxury and ease than of strength and power at arms. After the Restoration, this emblem of vanity faded before the advancing light of Western life, but, suggestive as it was of artistic beauty and high-class leisure, it remained with the women, and all classes adopted it as the marriage emblem. From then on, they blackened their teeth on their wedding day and kept them black ever after. The fashion is not an ugly one. When blackening every morning, the teeth look like polished ebony, and the gleam of shining black behind coral lips brings out the clear olive of the skin and looks as beautiful to Japanese eyes as did to the eyes of a European the dot of black court plaster on the ivory skin of a maiden in the days of colonial America. The custom is now dying out, but it is still seen everywhere in rural districts. Even in large cities, almost all old ladies of very high rank and of very humble station still cling to the custom. The middle class of Japan always leads the way in progress. Chapter 31. Worthless treasures. We spent a happy week with Sister in the little silkworm village, and our visit was almost ended when one day she took us to her big go-down, where the things brought from Nagaoka had been stored. The greater part of our ancient treasures were now only worthless burdens, but there were some things that I wanted the children to see, for in the old days they had been both useful and beautiful, and to me were still full of precious memories. We passed through the heavy door, a foot thick of fireproof plaster, and entered a large room, all four sides filled with shelves, most of them crowded full to the edge. There were rows and rows of high narrow boxes containing a whole library of soft-back books. There were rows of still larger boxes holding small eating tables, and still others filled with dishes, trays, and all the reserved belongings of a prosperous household. There were long, slender boxes of roll pictures and many ornaments, bronze vases, incense burners, and carvings of wood and ivory, all neatly tied up in squares of cotton or silk and placed within convenient reach, ready for the frequent changes necessary in a Japanese house. Part of the floor was taken up with chests of drawers arranged in rows, back to back, and in corners stood tall candlesticks, screens, and various large articles of household use. "Just look!" cried Hanano, gazing about her in astonishment. "I never saw so many things at once in my life." "It's like a store," said Chio, "only everything is put away so nicely, and yet it's all mixed up too." "Don't be critical of my housekeeping," laughed Sister. "A well-fitted go-down is said to be the best museum of household belongings that is to be found in all Japan, and it ought to be, for it is the place where we keep everything that is not in immediate use. Things are put in and pulled out every day. I never knew of a go-down that looked in order." But Sister's go-down really was in disorder, for in some half-filled shelves and in a wide space beyond the wooden steps leading to the floor above were gathered a lot of objects from our Nagaoka go-downs, for which suitable places had not yet been found. Among some high lantern stands wrapped in oil paper and a pile of boxes containing war banners, I saw the big cumbersome palanquin that Father had used on his official trips to the capital in the years before the name was changed from Yedo to Tokyo. The lacquer was dulled, the metal ornaments tarnished, and the brocade cushions faded, but Hanano thought it wondrously elegant. She crept inside, settled herself comfortably on the thick cushion, rested her elbow on the lacquer armrest, and peeped into the toilet box in the silk pocket in front. Then she glanced at the misty reflection of her face in the metal hanging mirror and declared that Honourable Grandfather's travelling coach was convenient and comfortable enough for a trip all the way to America. As she climbed out, I pushed at the padded top, but the hinges were rusted. It used to lift and swing back. Many a time when on a hurried trip, Father had dressed while his carriers were trotting fast and Gio running by his side to help him now and then. "Here's another palanquin prettier than yours, Hanano," chirped Chio from behind the stairs. "Only this one hasn't any doors." "Ma," laughed Sister, going over to her. "This is not to ride in, little Chio. It's for a swim." And she lifted her into her enormous bathtub of red lacquer, which, from my earliest recollection, had stood in a corner of our go-down. We used it for holding the cocoons until the maids were ready to put them on the spindle to twist the silk threads off the poor little cooked inhabitants. The tub was marred on the edge, but not chipped anywhere, for the lacquer was of olden time. It still held the deep softness of velvet, and the band of braided bamboo showed beneath the polished surface like water weeds in a clear stream. It must have been very old, for it had been brought to our family as part of the wedding dowry of my 3 times great-grandmother, the daughter of Yodo Daimyo, inaba no kami. "Climb out, Chio, climb out and come here," called Hanano. "I found a wooden stovepipe hat. Only," she added, peering into it, "it has a funny inside." She was standing in a shadowy corner where a number of miscellaneous articles were gathered in a crowded shelf and had just lifted the tail cover from a shallow bucket of whitewood, the bottom having in its centre, rising sharp and strong, a short hardwood spike. It was Father's head bucket that had always been kept in the closed shelf closet above our parlour tokonoma. "Let us go upstairs now," I said quickly. "Sister, won't you show the children your wedding cap of silk floss? They have never seen an old-fashioned wedding where the bride's cap comes down to the chin." I hurried them up the narrow stairs to the room above. I did not want to explain to the children the use of the head bucket. Their modern practical education held nothing that would enable them to understand the deep sentiment of honour which has inspired many an ancient samurai who, when guilty of some unlawful act, has chosen to die an honourable death by his own hand, rather than bring up his family the disgrace of a public execution. In such a case, the head bucket, one of which every samurai house possessed, was used to carry to court the proof that the law had been obeyed. After being identified by the authorities, the head was returned with respectful ceremonies to the family, and the dead samurai, his crime now fully expiated, was buried with honour. Of course, the gruesome mission of our head bucket had never been fulfilled. Its only duty had been the occasional holding of a coil of hemp when Honourable Grandmother or Ishi was twisting it ready to spin. It was convenient for that purpose as a flax box. Indeed, the two looked very much alike that no bride was ever allowed to have a flax box, although in those days all other spinning implements were considered essential to every wedding dowry. The upstairs room of Sister's Go-Down was lighted by narrow iron-barred windows set deep in the thick plaster wall. The shutters, which were really heavy plaster doors, were open, and a pleasant breeze was blowing through the room, making it cool and airy. Against the walls were chests of drawers and great wooden boxes having metal bands, on some of which I saw the Inagaki crest. I could readily guess what Sister's chest contained, for her large house was well stocked with all the requirements of a country home. There were padded silk comforts, round pillows for men, and little lacquer box pillows for women, large mosquito nets made to swing by short cords from the corners of the ceiling, thus enclosing the entire room, and cushions of every kind, soft, thick ones of heavy silk for winter, thin ones of woven grass for summer, braided bamboo for the porch, woven rope for the kitchen, some round, some square, some plain, and some elaborately dyed in patterns. For cushions were our chairs, and every house had to have a supply always on hand. "This holds my treasure dresses," said Sister, waving her hand towards a low chest of drawers. "The clothes that I wear I keep downstairs within easy reach, but some of these have been in the family for more than 200 years. She took out an elaborately embroidered trained garment with a scarlet lining and heavy padded hem, a dress of ceremony worn, even in ancient times, only on state occasions. It looked fresh and almost new, for Japanese women are careful housekeepers, and probably this gown had been shaken out and examined on every airing day since it was first used by the ancestor of long ago. "It looks just like the splendid dresses we saw in that play at the Tokyo Theatre, doesn't it?" said Hanano. And indeed it did, for only on the stage were these gorgeous costumes to be seen in modern life. The next drawer held Sister's wedding dresses, 7 of them. There was the soft white linen emblem of death to her own home, the scarlet silk, emblem of birth to her husband's family, and the 5 other elaborately embroidered gowns bearing her husband's crest and the marriage emblems of pine, bamboo, and plum. "Here is the wedding cap you asked to see," said Sister presently, unfolding something that looked like a great satiny mushroom. It was of exquisite pressed silk floss and made to fit rather close over the head and shoulders. It looked like a thick, shining veil. "Oh, isn't it pretty?" cried Chio, delighted. "Put it on, Hanano, and let's see how you look." I gave a half-frightened gasp and was glad when Hanano, with a slow smile, shook her head. I don't know why the child refused. Perhaps the white softness of the snowy floss suggested in some vague way the white mourning clothes we had worn at Mother's funeral. While there was no definite superstition regarding the wearing of wedding garments after ceremony, still it was never done. They were laid away to wait. Both Honourable Grandmother and my mother wore the wedding dress beneath the death robe when they were ready for the last journey. The very next chest, just as marriage and death go hand in hand as the 2 most important ceremonies in Japanese life, held articles for the funeral. This chest was one of those from my home, and it was about half filled with a disordered array of ceremonious uniforms for the men who carried the tall lanterns, the bamboo dove cage, and the heavy death kago. These were all made of linen, since no silk was ever used at a funeral. There were also pleated skirts and a stiff shoulder garments for retainers with no family crest, white banded servant kimonos, boxes of knee bands, pilgrim sandals, and countless small articles essential for the various attendants in the elaborate procession. I could remember when the chest contained everything requisite for a samurai funeral except the wide straw hats that shade the sorrowing faces from the sun goddess. Those had to be fresh and new for each occasion. The house of every high official always had these things in readiness, for death often comes without warning, and Japanese rules for ceremonious occasions were strict and unvarying. "There," said Sister as she closed the lid of the chest and pushed the metal bar through the triple clasp. "The usefulness of these things belongs with their glory to the past. Sometimes I cut up a garment to get linen binding for a worn-out mat, and occasionally, when workman breaks his sandal cord, I present him with a pair of sandals from this chest, but the things go slowly, slowly. But this," she added, gently tapping a drawer in a fresh whitewood chest, "belongs to the future. It will be used some day." "What is it?" I asked. "My death robe." "Oh, Sister," I said earnestly, "please show it to the children. They saw Mother's, of course, but I had no chance to explain the meaning." She opened the drawer and lifted out her shroud. We all sat very quiet, for as it was folded it looked exactly like the one we had placed on Mother. It was made of soft white linen, and instead of a sash had a narrow band like that of a baby's first dress. For the belief was that we enter the next world as an infant. The robe was almost covered with text from the Buddhist scriptures, which had been written by famous priests at various times. A blank strip in the front showed that it was not yet finished. Beside the robe lay a small white bag intended to be placed around the neck. It would contain, when all was ready for Sister's last journey, a tiny package of her baby hair, shaved off on the christening ceremony, when she was 8 days old, the dried navel cord, her cut widow hair, a 6 rin coin to pay the ferryman, a death rosary of white wooden beads, and a sacred tablet called the Heavenly Pass. While Sister was refolding the robe, she glanced up at the grave faces of the children and broke into a merry laugh. "Why so sad, thou solemn-faced ones?" she cried. "Would it not be a disgrace should I receive a telegram to go home and have no suitable dress for the journey?" "Yes, children," I added. It is as natural and commonplace for everyone in Japan to be ready for the last journey as it is in America to have a trunk in the house. Come over this way, said Sister, leading us to the other side of the room. Here is something that belongs to you, Etsubo. You had better take charge of it. She pulled out a narrow drawer. Within, wrapped in purple crepe on which was the Inagaki crest, lay a slender parcel about a foot long. My heart gave a bound. It was one of our 3 family treasures, the saihai, used by Tokugawa Ieyasu and presented by him to my ancestor on the battlefield of Sekigahara. Reverently I lifted the precious thing to my forehead. Then, bidding the children sit with bowed heads, I slowly unwrapped the square of crepe, disclosing a short, thick rod of lacquered wood, having on one end a silk cord for a wrist loop, and on the other a bronze chain clasp that held a bunch of soft, tough paper cut in strips. We all sat very quiet while Sister told the children of the brave ancestor who, in a time of peril, saved the life of his great overlord, and how Ieyasu, in gracious remembrance, presented him with his own blood-stained coat, his wonderful Matsumune sword, and this rod which he kept, used in guiding his followers on the battlefield. And, concluded the sister, all 3 are still kept in the Inagaki family as sacred treasures. It looks just like a plain wooden stick, doesn't it? Whispered Chiyo to Hanano. So it is, said Sister, as plain as the most simple director rod used by any ancient general, for Ieyasu lived in the age when was written, an ornamental scabbard signifies a dull blade. The pieces of paper are so yellow and ragged, said Hanano. Did they used to be white? Yes, I answered. They are yellow because they are so old, and the reason the papers are ragged is because so many pieces have been torn off for people to eat. To eat! Exclaimed both children, horrified. I couldn't help smiling as I explained that many people used to believe that because the saihai had been held in the hand of Ieyasu, the paper strips possessed the magical power of healing. I've heard my mother say that sick people often came from long distances just to beg for a bit of the paper to roll into a pallet and swallow as a cure. Father always laughed, but he told Mother to give the paper, saying that it was less harmful than most medicine, and that belief alone frequently cures. We were starting to go downstairs when I stopped beside a large whitewood box, having the overlapping lid and the curved feet of the temple book chest. It stood on a platform raised a little above the floor. I had seen this box in my childhood, but never except on airing days, and always it had the sacred Shinto rope around it. With some hesitation, I called Sister to come back. I am very bold, I said, but would you mind if I asked you to open the kiri wood box? Our feelings have changed since the old days, and I would so like for the children. Etsubo, you asked to gaze upon sacred things, Sister began hastily. Then, stopping abruptly, she shrugged her shoulders. After all, woman's eyes have already looked upon it, she added a little bitterly. The new order of things has done much to take the spirit of reverence from us all. Then we, she at one end and I at the other, lifted off the lid just as Gia and Yoshita in their ceremonial dresses used to do long ago. I felt a little awestruck as we leaned over and looked within. Some of the sacred relics had been removed. The coat and sword of Ieyasu were in charge of another branch of the family, and Brother had taken the books of the Inagaki genealogy. But before us, lying shroud-like in its pressed stillness, was a garment, once white but now yellowed by time. A pointed cap and an ancient unfolding fan of thin wood lay on top. It was the sacred robe which was used when the daimyo or his representative officiated as high priest in the temple dedicated to his ancestors and was believed to possess heavenly power. My grandmother had told me that once, when it was worn by my great-grandfather. A miracle had been performed beneath the shadow of its widespread sleeve. We gazed only a moment, then the box was silently closed. Neither sister nor I spoke of it again, but I knew that she felt as I did, that we had been a little daring in lifting the lid of this box, which, in ancient days, was always kept in the holy room, even the entrance hall of which was never profaned by women's foot. I had grown away from my childhood faith in these things, but not entirely away from the sudden influence of memory and thoughts, beautiful and solemn, were crowding my mind when there came a sudden bang from one of the heavy swinging windows. They were always closed from the outside by a servant with a long pole, and evidently were being shut this time by someone who did not know we were still there. "Mama, it's late. Make haste." "I inhospitably beg you," laughed sister, and we all scrambled down the narrow stairs and out of the door, hearing the windows bang one after the other behind us, shutting the godown with all its treasures into darkness. Chapter 32. The Black Ships. The night before we sailed, my Tokyo uncle called, bringing with him a package of friendship ribbons for the children, those frail, dainty, quivery strips that bind the hands of friends between deck and dock at the moment of starting and parting. "I'll hold a pink one for Toshiko and a blue one for Kuni-san," cried Chio, as the bright-coloured rolls tumbled out of the package. "And a white one for my teacher, and a purple one for you, Uncle Tosa. 2 of the most beautiful for you of any colour you choose." "I'll hold a whole bunch of red and white ones for all Japan," said Hanano. "Love, much love and goodbye, for I'll never come back. I love everybody here, but I'm going to stay forever with Grandma in Home Sweet Home." And she softly hummed the tune as she slipped away, her face full of light. Ah, how little she dreamed that in years to come she would return more than once, and always with a heart full of double loyalty, half for the land of her birth and half for the land of love, where were husband, children, and home. Hanano and Chio had gone to bed, and I was attending to the last scattered duties of the packing when Suzu lifted a folded shawl to lay on top of the tray before closing a trunk. "This is rather loose," she said. "A cushion would exactly fit, but how ridiculous it would be to carry to a great country like America just an ordinary cushion that we sit on." She did not know that in the bottom of my trunk of greatest value was something which, until I had seen it in sister's go-down, I'd never dreamed could be anywhere except beside the familiar firebox in the room of Honourable Grandmother. It was a square, flat cushion of blue brocade, old and somewhat faded. I was alone when I wrapped it for its long journey, and as my hands passed over the silken flowers, my mind went back to the days when the little black-haired girl in wooden clogs clattered through the big gateway and, hurrying her polite bows of greeting to the family, spread out before her grandmother, who was seated on this very cushion, a large flat book. "Honourable Grandmother," she said, pointing to a coloured map of the world, "I am much, much troubled. I have just learned that our beloved land is only a few tiny islands in the great world." The grandmother adjusted her big horn spectacles and for a few minutes carefully studied the map. Then with slow dignity she closed the book. "It is quite natural, little Etsuko, for them to make Japan look small on this map," she said. "It was made by the people of the Black Ships. Japan is made large on the Japanese maps of the world." "Who are the people of the Black Ships?" asked the little girl. They are the red barbarians who came uninvited to our sacred land. They came in big black ships that moved without sails. I know, Ishi sings it to me, and her shrill little voice chanted, They came from a land of darkness, giants with hooked noses like a mountain imp, giants with rough hair, loose and red. They stole a promise from our sacred master and danced with joy as they sailed away to the distant lands of darkness. I wonder why they were called black ships. Do you know, Honourable Grandmother? Because far out on the waters they look like clouds of black smoke, rolling nearer and nearer, and they had long black guns that roared. The red barbarians cared nothing for beauty. They laughed at the Japanese boats, whose sails were made of rich brocade, and their oars of carved wood inlaid with coral and mother of pearl. They talked like tradesmen and did not want to learn the hearts of the children of the gods. The grandmother stopped and slowly shook her head. And after that, asked the eager little voice, and after that, Honourable Grandmother? The black ships and the rude barbarians sailed away, she concluded with a deep sigh, but they sailed back many times. They are always sailing. And now the people of our sacred land also talk like tradesmen and no longer are peaceful and content. Will they never be peaceful and content again? Asked the little girl with anxious eyes. The honourable teacher said that sailing ships bring lands nearer to each other. Listen, said the grandmother, holding herself very straight. Little granddaughter, unless the red barbarians and the children of the gods learn each other's hearts, the ships may sail and sail, but the two lands will never be nearer. Years passed, and Etsuko, the little girl who had listened to the story of the black ships and the red barbarians, herself went sailing on a black ship that moved without sails to a new home in the distant land of the red barbarians. There she learned that hearts are the same on both sides of the world, but this is a secret that is hidden from the people of the East and hidden from the people of the West. That makes another chapter to my grandmother's tale. Another chapter, but not the last. The red barbarians and the children of the gods have not yet learned each other's hearts. To them, the secret is still unknown. But the ships are sailing, sailing. The end. If you have been enjoying this audiobook, please take the time to subscribe. It would really help the station. If you could also like or leave a comment or share this station with other friends, that would be great. Thank you.